he got a master's in botany from a university in South Africa, which was kind of a composite university between separate universities, which merged together after the demise of the apartheid policies. And I had actually never heard of it before, but now it's called KwaZulu. And then he went on back to the United States and earned a PhD in organismic and evolutionary biology from Harvard University in 2011. And then as a postdoc, he taught in the First Origins field course at the Turkana Basin Institute, where Bob and my daughter attended. And so I've been hearing about Dino Martins and all his studies for a long time. Anyway, so this fall, and then he's been a director of Princeton University's Impala Research Center in Kenya. And then recently he was asked and invited to be the director of the TBI Institute, which is associated with the anthropology department here at the university. But his expertise is actually on these nasty, well, no, bees are wonderful, but they can be nasty. And last time I was there, it was very dry, and the bees sometimes will make nests in water drains or water faucets. And so thinking that I was going to be able to wash my hands, I ended up with a super sting on my finger, which hurt for days. But anyway, and then I went back to my room, and there was this container that you could use. It had a little soap powder in it, and there was a picture of the bee on it. So I had to look at this guy for a long time. But anyway, I'm sorry. With please come and
Thank you.
talk to us.
Thank you, everyone. And yes, I just had a very nice walk over here. There weren't any bees, sadly, although there were quite a few flies out today because it's a warm day as we get towards winter. So, as very kindly introduced by Professor Aller, I'm wearing several hats today. I'm here as you know, part of the Turkana Basin Institute, but I am also here sharing some of the work we do in Kenya. And today's talk will be a bit rambling to different things, but really to show you some of the opportunities and some of the ideas and some of the things that are going on at the Turkana Basin Institute, which is located in northern Kenya. It's part of Stony Brook, and Stony Brook are part of us. But this is a map showing you where we are in Kenya. So the main city of about 5 million people is down here. That's Nairobi. And this is the Turkana Basin up here in northern Kenya. Lake Turkana, which some of you are familiar with, is the world's largest desert lake. So as was hinted at, it is a very hot, very arid landscape. In fact, right now, experiencing an extreme drought that has gone on for over 2 years. But this lake has been, you know, there in existence for a very long period of time. It has changed over time. But the most famous aspect of the science around this lake has been conducted by the Leakey family for over 60 years. And they found lots and lots of different important fossils. So as remote and hot and distant as this place might seem, it's actually a very important part of both human history and scientific history, in that this is where many of the early and more recent discoveries about a common origin in Africa based on human evolution have come out. And you know, the research is very famous. The most famous being the Turkana boy, which is this Homo erectus skeleton that was found by Dr. Leakey and Kamoya Kimeyu and his team, and you know, really went on to establish firmly that, you know, even though we all look so different, we're actually also similar. and we all have a common origin in Africa. And then more recently, the work is focused on finding the oldest stone tools. Professor Sonia Armand, who's here in the Department of Anthropology, pushed the date of all technology back from 2.5 to 3.3 million years. And other really amazing work is ongoing, such as the discoveries of more recent material in the basin. But the basin has over 100 million years worth of evolution recorded in it. There are dinosaur fossils. The lake itself is very interesting because of its connection through the Nile to the Mediterranean. And there's just so much opportunity there. And I'm going to share a little bit about that. So the campus is in a very beautiful spot. It's on the edge of the Turkana River, which comes out of the highlands of northwestern Kenya and goes, many, many miles through different landscapes. And we're just on the edge of the river. And this is the campus over here. It's an aerial picture. So that's the main lab. There are dormitories, there are cottages. And the ecosystem is very interesting because you have very interesting geology. And then in this direction is the open desert, the South Turkana Desert, which is a very, very arid region. It is inhabited by pastoralists mainly. But on the edges of the river are riverine forests and then these woodlands which stretch out from where the campus is located. They're mainly of an acacia species, Acacia tortilis. So very interesting landscape, a very beautiful landscape, and it's been a wonderful place. I finished up my PhD at Harvard, and Dr. Leakey, who's sadly passed away in January this year, came to my defense. And I was actually offered a position at Harvard. I was going to stay on E.O. Wilson, I can drop a name there, but a very famous professor, and also passed away sadly December last year. And Calestis Juma, who was a Kenyan professor at Harvard, had been the head of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And both Ed and Calestis had said, Dino, you have to stay at Harvard. As a Kenyan scientist, you need to stay there and rise to the top of your field, and you will have a bigger impact on the world as just a young, freshly minted PhD. And Dr. Leakey came to the defense, and his one purpose was to disrupt these plans and said, no, Dino, you're not accepting this offer from Harvard. You're actually coming back to Kenya. And I said, Richard, I will come back to Kenya and I'll be unemployed because there aren't jobs for scientists. And he said, no, you know about the Turkana Basin Institute. And I knew I'd actually already taught for one of the field schools. And we'll have you as a postdoc there, and you'll go on to do your own research. And so, it's actually just over 10 years later that I was looking back at some of our history. And so I'm really honored to be in this role and to continue this collaboration. And I've taken a different path as a scientist. I know there are many young scientists in the room, but I'm going to talk a little bit about that journey as well as the other young scientists that we've had the great pleasure and honor of working with. So there are two campuses in northern Kenya. They are on either side of Lake Turkana. One at the South Turkana, which is in Turkana County, which is the largest county in Kenya by land area. The other one in Marsabit County, which is the second largest county in Kenya. The field stations were really established to provide support for researchers. The central mission of having these campuses in this incredibly remote area is that all of the logistics and all of the support and all of the kind of day-to-day things like power and water and everything else, vehicles are provided. But more importantly, the reason that these campuses were built in Turkana is that after many decades of working in that landscape, Dr. Leakey wanted to give back to those communities. So the land we are on belongs to the people of Turkana and of Marsabit. It is given as a lease to the institute, but it still belongs to the traditional people and the indigenous people in that area. And the other big part of this was not just being there physically, but actually engaging with and training and interacting with both local communities, with indigenous communities, as well as more broadly with African scientists and students. So that's a very important part of what the mission of the Institute is around, and something that I'm very committed to growing as much as I can. So here is a picture of Dr. Leakey with some of, this is up on the roof of the building. It's a nice cool area to sit with some of the field school students. And that has been something that has been a part of TBI since the very beginning. It's running a field school through Stony Brook University as a study abroad program. And we've welcomed hundreds of students from Stony Brook, as well as from other institutions and from across the African continent. We've had students from Kenya, from Tanzania, from Ethiopia, from Angola, from other countries within the area. I've taught for every single field school since we started the program. So it has been actually very interesting working with the different students and learning from them. And I teach a course that's called Modern and Ancient Environments. It's an introduction to ecology and evolution, but basically is a course where we spend a lot of time in the field. We have a lot of fun and we just explore and discover, and students get to both learn about some of the basics of, doing experiments in the field, setting up a testable hypothesis, collecting some preliminary data, but also learn from the communities that we work in, learn from that landscape. And really learning in the field is very different and very special. It's different from learning in a classroom, but it's a critically important part of what we do, and one of the resources that we have in terms of a place that you can actually see evolution and see ecology and see the many challenges. I'll talk about them in a minute. We've had a number of programs that have worked through Stony Brook and the Turkana Basin Institute, and this Origins Field School, which is still running, summer programs. There's even been a poetry workshop, innovation field school, summer camps, and lots of different students have been there. But really, the opportunities for increasing some of this collaboration and this connection between Stony Brook and TBI are very, very broad, and I'll look through some of them. So the first and most important thing about what we do is the community. How science gets done, who gets to be called a scientist, where the science is done is a really important part of what we do. But we're in a part of the world where there are many other issues that need to be addressed. It's remote. Even within Kenya, it's considered a marginal area. It hasn't had as much development and infrastructure and education as other parts of Kenya. And so working with the local community and with our both immediate neighbors as well as more broadly in that landscape is a critical part of what we do. We are able, thanks to students and scientists coming to Kenya and being partners on grants and projects, as well as the connection we have with Stony Brook, we offer a lot of outreach activities like basic clinics. We also have a scholarship program. So about 300 students from the community there are sponsored in schools. They are outstanding students who are doing very well in school, but their families don't necessarily have the resources to keep them in school. And this is especially important in this landscape for girls and young women who tend to be taken out of school to work on with their families or other things. And so keeping kids in school and providing these opportunities is a really important part of what we do. The other thing is we're in a landscape with immense challenges around the water, energy, and food. And so we have a program that is specifically looking at this, that has had some of the scientists from Stony Brook involved. We've had scientists from MIT, but it's led by an amazing team in Kenya that are really trying to solve the problems of if we're going to do science in the field, we need things like water, we need things like electricity, we need obviously enough food. How can we provide that in a landscape that's extremely remote and difficult to work in, that's very resource deprived? So also doing it in a way that's sustainable, because I know that's a big part of what many people, including yourselves, are thinking about. So the entire campus runs on solar power, and the solar power system has been built over many years. But we're very proud to say that we have, 24/7 internet, we have the lights on, we have many of the comforts, even a few fans if people desperately need them when it's hot. And that is all based on a solar power system that with a lot of quirks, we've had to develop kind of ourselves over the last decade. The other big challenge up in Turkana is water. It is a desert, and so we're running a campus, we all need water to drink, we need water to use domestically, and we also share that water with our neighboring communities. And so the water system up there is really one that, again, has been developed over time with a lot of input from scientists, because the challenge with a lot of the groundwater is that it's very high in fluoride and other dissolved minerals. And so how do you actually filter that water? How do you store it? How do you use it sustainably is a very big part of what we're looking into. And it's a huge area for potential research, because even though the world's largest desert lake is located in the Turkana Basin, most of the communities there do not have access to water. And it's a really big problem. And so getting systems that can work, that can provide clean water, drinkable water. The lake itself is mildly alkaline. It's on the threshold of what WHO consider potable. But right now, the irony is in a drought, the lake has actually been flooding. And many of the Rift Valley lakes are higher than they've been for a long period of time. And so it's these contradictions we see with climate change. Is how can it be that there's a drought that's gone on for 2 years and livestock are dying and people are hungry, but there's also these floods. And so making sense of this changing and rapidly changing world is something that we're very well positioned to help engage with. And we need more students and more scientists to come and look at these questions and look at these problems and work with us. The other really cool thing that we've developed over time is a hydroponics farm. So producing food in this landscape, which has traditionally been a pastoralist landscape for thousands of years, people have lived in these harsh conditions, and they've been able to turn that, very dry, inhospitable, thorny vegetation into nutrition, into extremely high quality nutrition through their livestock. But that is changing due to climate change, population growth, environmental degradation. So there is a need to produce, fresh food and to do it in a way that is sustainable. So the hydroponics farm is one of these things where we're actually taking a very modern technology and applying it using a recycled water and nutrient system to grow vegetables. We're harvesting about 1/2 ton of vegetables every quarter. And just right now, I'm modifying the menu so that we can actually make better use of these. At the institute I used to run, we managed to get to a point where every other meal we served was vegan or vegetarian, because most of our students and users were actually preferring to eat that way and to try and be more sustainable. So we're in the process of figuring out now, how can we use these vegetables? How can we actually share them as well, and the technology? So the other really big thing that's happening is a lot of training. So many communities from around the basin are coming to us to learn these newer technologies so that they can take ownership of food production. For those of you who are familiar with Turkana, you will know that over the last few decades, what has happened is the shift from a traditional diet, a very nutrient-rich, low-calorie diet, to a very high-calorie, low-nutrient diet, mainly provided by food aid. And if you go around, you will see sacks with the American flag on them saying, "A gift of the American people." And that's great that the food's being provided, but it's also coming at a very high cost. I'm not going to talk about my work in genomics and diet today, but we're finding that Turkana traditionally, it's hard to find truly traditional people anymore, but those who are really still traditional eat about 1,600 calories a day. For most of us, that would be a starvation diet. On those 1,600 calories, they're in actually very good health. They reach the same stature as Western societies in terms of height, beautiful, strong bones and teeth, and generally, very, very well-nourished people. But there are very few people who we can still find leading that traditional lifestyle and eating a traditional diet. And it turns out, even though it's 1,600 calories, it's one of the most nutrient-rich but low-calorie diets. Whereas what has now happened with the switch, as it has in many parts of the world, is a switch to a very high-calorie, low-nutrient diet. And that is having major health impacts on that community, with metabolic issues and diabetes and other things, but that's for another day. So other really cool things that are happening now in Turkana, we just received a telescope that was part of this bigger program that NASA launched to redirect the asteroid, the DART mission, the asteroid redirection technology. And so those of you who've been following it, this was absolutely very cool. And we actually got to watch it and take pictures because we received one of these telescopes in partnership with the University of Edinburgh, set up the telescope, and they were able to take 80,000 images of the impact because two things. They needed a place with a really clear night sky, which we luckily have, with low light pollution, which we also have, and close to the equator, obviously, which we are. So the wonderful thing with this is it set up a new opportunity for really doing the sort of bigger picture science and looking at some of the earth and planetary sciences more deeply in Kenya. But also what was really wonderful was to involve a lot of young people and local schools who had never actually had a chance to look through a telescope at the sky and to really see it in detail. Now, of course, everybody sees the sky there every night because you sit outside and that's where you have a lot of your social life. So it's been a great connection of learning also from the traditional astronomy, connecting it with what is happening in sort of the cutting edge science. So there's a lot of opportunity and the things that I like to work on, which are the biodiversity issues and climate change and health. The basin is incredibly rich in species. I'll show you in a few minutes some other slides about some of the work. But insect life, there aren't as many big mammals anymore. Most of them are fossilized, but there are still a lot of species that live in the desert. These are jackals here. These are two hornbills, swarms of locusts. I'll come back and talk about them in a moment. Lots of different insect life. So most of the work I've done is focused on the insect life. We've been running malaise traps. So we're part of a big global survey to look at both the diversity of insects as well as just start understanding them. And this program runs all over the world, but we have several sites in Kenya. But the Turkana malaise trap is really interesting because all the data goes into a thing called the barcode of life, which is a big online system that many different scientists can contribute to. And through that system, we get the insects out of the trap, we get them sequenced, and you start doing some basic taxonomy and just understanding the fauna. The remarkable thing with the Turkana trap is that we have things that are showing up that don't match any known order on GenBank, which is really remarkable. It just shows you how little is known about this part of the world, but also how distinctive the biodiversity is here. And so the lake itself is another wonderful resource to do research on, which several of you are involved in. The livelihoods in this part of the world are really focused on two things. There's livestock, here's a herd of sheep and goats, and fishing. This is actually a part of the lake that's flooding. You can see over the trees are starting to die off, and these are fishing boats. They're really two critical aspects without which, in Turkana County, over 1 million people are now part of that landscape, depending primarily on livestock. But with the drought right now, I was just talking with some of the students who are working on doing household surveys for some of the churches. The Catholic Church is very active in providing food relief to the communities. And they said, we just done a survey and we found out that only between 3 to 5% of the calories people were consuming were coming from their livestock, which means 95% or more is coming from the food aid that's being brought in by either the church or the government or other international organizations. So that's a very, very big shift that's happened. And it's happened in the last few years. And we can have many debates about pastoralism. But one of the things I'd like to point out is that it has been a way of life for thousands of years in this landscape, including under very harsh conditions. But what is it that is changing now that is seeing it collapse? Because it has persisted for many thousands of years longer than we've been farmers. We've actually been pastoralists as human beings. So something is shifting, and it's a really, really big question we have right now, and how are we going to continue to be able to survive in these landscapes, with or without livestock. I'm a big advocate of having the livestock, but we have to change how we do it and how we manage it, because we really are seeing a change and a collapse in those systems. With fishing, several of you have worked on the lake, and we have had students and postdocs and scientists engage. There's actually quite a bit of data on Lake Turkana, because early on in the colonial period, there were surveys that were started, and some of those have been continued by KEFRI, which is the Kenya Fisheries Research Institute. But right now, that fisheries is in a very challenged place, because it still remains fairly productive, but the demand for fish from the lake is at an all-time high, and Kenya's actually fish markets are undersupplied. So a lot of the fish here is actually, it's delicious fish because the water is mildly alkaline. It has the taste and texture of a sea fish more than a lake fish. So it's very locally in demand, but also being shipped out. Much of the fish there is smoked and dried, and it's transported to other markets, all the way to the Congo, all the way to other parts of Africa. So there are these amazing trade routes that have existed for a long time, but now, of course, have entered the globalized world of taking the fish away from the lake to other markets. But I was just teaching another course, and we were looking at all these statistics around fish consumption and milk and livestock and meat. And it turns out now 80% of the fish fillets sold in Kenya come from China. So Kenya is now importing a lot of the fish it consumes mainly from China. And these are big shifts that have happened. So as a Kenyan, I'm really alarmed by this, because it's not just fish. In the last sort of decade or two, Kenya has gone from being a self-reliant country for its food to being a net importer of food. And that's, we're hearing about that because of the war in Ukraine and the big impact it's having on many countries. But it is also, for me, a reminder of what we need to engage with as scientists in some of these bigger issues, and how the science can have an impact. So I'm going to share with you a couple of examples. Some of you will recognize some of the people in some of these pictures. This is one of the early field schools in Turkana. Here we are down by the river. We had a wonderful group of students, a mixture of both Stony Brook as well as other international students, and the several Kenyan and East African students. But I'm going to share with you a few examples of the work that's been done mainly by my students in terms of projects that are just looking at this landscape, trying to generate some information and ask interesting questions. So a big issue of looking at this part of the world is that, while every aid agency is bringing in food aid, that's mainly a mixture of different things. I don't think anyone here has tried any of the food aid. Has anyone tried the food aid that's distributed in Turkana? It's a gift from the American people, but it seems the American people don't actually eat it themselves. So you will see, I should have brought a packet of it with me. We could have had it for the next seminar. We'll get you some. It's something called plumpy nut. So plumpy nut is manufactured here in America. It's a high concentrated mixture of peanut butter. All sorts of micronutrients and other things are added to it, and high fructose corn syrup. And so there's a soybean extract that goes into it. It's actually a very, very interesting system of how they do it, because they try and fit the most bang into the smallest area, because they have to ship it. It's also produced as a paste that you can immediately eat. You don't have to cook it. It's sort of that yellow color that you see over there. Bilious yellow, and you squeeze it out of these packets, the beautiful silver packets that it comes in, and you can provide it directly as a food. And of course, for people who have nothing else, it is a very important source of nutrition, and it is, there's a huge global industry around it. But traditionally, if people were not eating plumpy nut, mainly made from Midwestern US ingredients, what they would be living on in this landscape are the livestock. And most of that diet actually came from milk, primarily in the last few decades from goats. So an average household, not a family, a household, because this is a polygamous society, is about 8 people. So a mother and her children is a household in Turkana, about 8 people, and they require 40 goats to sustain them if they're going to milk the goats and just have enough milk from those goats to sustain that household. So in Turkana, it is still a partly traditional society. Many men marry more than one wife. And so in that, a family unit is usually several households combined together. But it's because of this species that everybody hates, but they're actually really remarkable animals, the goats, that people can survive in this landscape. But traditionally, there's been a shift. The communities here used to keep cattle, and most of the pastoral groups in the Horn of Africa were cattle keeping cultures. And over the last 50, 60 years, they've shifted to sheep and goats. And actually, even that is starting to change, and people are shifting to camels. I'll show you that in a moment. But the goats in this landscape and all of the livestock feed on a little shrub called indigofera. It's a little legume that grows. It's a tough little plant that grows out in the desert. And it produces these little leaves and it produces pods. And so that's what we've had the students work on. But one of the challenges of working in these big landscapes is really how will you measure things and how will you get data that you can actually have a comparison. So here's the road up to Ferguson's Gulf, Calico, which I know some of you have driven on. And if you're going up there, you wouldn't maybe have noticed, but there's a little plot on the side of the road that actually has all this grass and trees in it, whereas the rest of the landscape all around here is this very barren, very overgrazed, very degraded land. And this is, it turns out, was actually a research plot set up by scientists way, way, way back in the 1930s. And for the longest time, there was a little old man who lived there and protected this plot. That was his job. He'd been hired and he looked after it. And it was one of the few places we could go and look at grasses and look at some of the species that we were interested in, to see what this landscape was if we didn't have the numbers of livestock and the density of livestock that we currently do. So here's a view looking inside that plot. You can see this beautiful chest-high grass. And so a separate project that's connected to this is sort of to take a real tangential leap. Has anyone been to Texas? Yep. Anyone had a steak in Texas? Yeah. How was it good? Yep. Yeah. So if any of you have eaten any beef that has come from Texas or parts of the US, you will have eaten it based on this particular species of grass, buffalo grass. So buffalo grass was actually taken, it's considered an invasive species in some ways in the US, but it was taken from Turkana. It was collected again in the 1920s and 30s and brought and introduced to Texas. And the reason that was done is because the scientists working on these grasses saw that it was very productive in northern Kenya, and it was a similar landscape, and it could survive very high levels of grazing, and it had high amounts of protein. And so these grasses were taken from Kenya to many different parts of the world. Very sadly now, when they burn the Amazon forest, what do they plant? They plant Kikuyu grass, which comes from central Kenya, and they actually plant it using planes. That requires a much more moisture, but the buffalo grass from Turkana was taken to these other parts of the world and has sustained a livestock industry. And so that is one of the projects that we actually have in collaboration with the University of Texas now, is looking at the ecology and biodiversity and impacts of climate change and everything around this. So what we do with the students who've come on the field school can attest to this plant, which I love, but they probably get to, it's a love-hate relationship. See, they're very carefully counting the number of pods. This isn't a place that's more openly grazed. And each of these individual clumps, we've studied now, I have 10 years worth of data on this system, thanks to the field school. And they may look very small and not like very much, but actually they're very old. Some of the clumps themselves, even though they may only be a few inches high, could be 50 years old, because it's a perennial plant that grows at a very, very slow rate in the desert. But we look at a couple of things. We measure the height of the plants, which is down here, and we look at places that are protected from grazing by herbivores, and then where obviously they're being grazed, and not surprisingly, there's a big difference. And then we also count the number of pods. So two very simple bits of data that students go out and collect, and then use that to develop a hypothesis to understand this landscape and to look at data that previous students have collected in terms of what were the weather conditions and other variables. So the pods are really key. And so we will come to those in a moment. But this has actually been a great way of students engaging with this landscape, generating data that's very useful both to us, to the institute, as well as more broadly to the county and local government, and really understanding the impact of herbivores, which even in these landscapes of East Africa, where there's so much diversity of mammals, you can see that livestock and humans are the dominant source of how the vegetation gets used. And so it sets up a lot of other interesting questions for us to look at. So one of the other species that I absolutely love that we've been working on is the camel. And so those of you who have gotten to know camels, I mean, not only are they incredibly cute, they're actually very, very intelligent, and they're very emotional animals. They're very sensitive animals. If you treat them nicely, camels will learn to recognize you, and they will come and give you kisses. This was one just giving me a kiss in the morning not that long ago. Their breath does not usually smell very good, but it's a very important part of working with camels, is that you can actually develop the sort of individual relationships with them. And unlike sheep and goats or cows or other species who are wonderful, they have nothing on the camel in terms of of their intelligence. And there's a traditional saying they have there. They said, they asked the camel, do you like going uphill or downhill? And the camel's answer was, I don't like level ground either. So camels are sort of famous for their irascible nature, but they're actually really remarkable animals. But what is actually happening is really interesting. As cattle have disappeared from the system due to the disappearance of grasses, which cattle are fundamentally grazers, sheep and goats, which are browsers, have come in and have filled up that niche in terms of livestock production. Now, due to droughts and climate change, sheep and goat are dying in very large numbers, and camels, which feed on shrubs and many other plants, are able to survive. And one of the interesting things we're looking at is actually the diet of the camels, and I'm going to connect that to bees, but you'll ask me how, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But most of the work I've done has been with pastoralists and small-scale farmers looking at biodiversity. So I really wanted to make a connection between this remarkable animal, the camel, in this area, and what plants they feed on. These are the main genera of species that they eat, and all the different biodiversity that we have in this landscape. So what we did, the initial method we used was to send a student out for 3 hours following one camel and recording everything that camel fed on, and making a list of it. And after sort of 3 hours, the camels are ruminants. So they'll feed for a period of time, and then they'll go and rest and digest the food. And what we found is that camels do depend on wild plants. And in this landscape, they eat over 300 species of plants. So their ability is to feed on many different things, and they can even eat things that are extremely toxic, like the euphorbias and sansevierias. They are toxic plants that if a goat or a cow fed on them, they drop dead within a couple of minutes. But the camel can eat them, and they're perfectly fine. And the milk they produce is very, very nutritious. It's very high in many different important micronutrients. It's low in lactose, so people who are lactose intolerant can drink it. It has a very different profile of fats, and several of the students I've supervised have worked on actually the dairy side of the camel's milk. But for this particular study we were interested in was making that connection between what camels are eating and what these plants are being pollinated. This is a Gynandropsis, one of the species the camel feeds on. And so we went out and we measured this and met following camels around. And as I said, if you treat them nicely, they'll cooperate. So first part was making sure you treated them nicely and got to know them and make friends with them. and then watch them feeding. Here they are on the South Turkana Desert. So in this environment, there's sort of two main plants. This is a Indigofera spinosa, Indigofera cercinella. So two of these legumes, and the pods are the main source of nutrition. And those pods come about because of the different insects that are visiting these plants. And we found many, many hundreds of different species of bees, a few butterflies, but primarily bees, different solitary bees. These are not social bees that are pollinating these plants, making the pods. And when we looked at this across different sites in Kenya, we will say for humans that 1 in 3 bites of food is thanks to a pollinator. Well, for the camel, sort of almost 9 out of 10 bites of food are thanks to a pollinator. So it's an ongoing study that we have to really now figure out, now how can we actually look at the camel in this landscape where actually most of the world's camels, the dromedary camel, the one-humped camel, are in the Horn of Africa. And so the numbers of camels, whereas the numbers of cattle are actually going down in that region because of the land degradation and climate change, the number of camels are actually going up. So we did this and we looked at it across many hundreds of species of forage that livestock are using. And we worked out that, bees, wild bees primarily, are the main pollinators, but many other aspects of biodiversity are important. Flies and butterflies and even birds and bats and other species are involved. And so in Turkana, so far, from this one area I've worked in, we have just been sorting through the bees. I had a student over the summer, and we're up to 700 species from one site, which is remarkable diversity. And you wouldn't think that a desert is so diverse, but one of the unusual things about bees is that they like hot, dry conditions. And most of the deserts, Southwest US, other parts of the world that are dry, have very high diverse bee faunas. So it's something we're starting to understand. But we've worked in a couple of other sites in Kenya. And the remarkable thing with the bees now is there's no overlap really between Turkana and some of these other sites. And we're finding similar patterns in the moths and other species that we look at. So a very unique biodiversity that's very important for that landscape. So I wanted to now talk about something that has a big impact on the pollinators that we all care a lot about, but another aspect of the work that's been going on in Turkana. So this is a landscape where energy and cooking and access to infrastructure are very, very fraught. And charcoal production is one of the key ways that people actually cook their food in many parts of Kenya, not just in Turkana. And charcoal is made by the burning wood in an anaerobic system. It's a traditional system to produce this charcoal that is then sold and distributed all over East Africa. So right now it's actually illegal in Kenya to trade in charcoal, but it's not illegal to use it, because it is, the government responded, it's typical government knee-jerk reaction that, oh, there's too many trees being cut down to make charcoal, but if more than 90% of people are using it, we need to figure out a solution that actually is based on good data that we actually can do, solve these problems of the charcoal system. So here's Lorraine, who's one of our field school students, and Lorraine actually now she's finished her PhD after, she was an undergraduate at Stony Brook, did a PhD at University of Washington, and I just checked on her this morning. She's got a job at National Geographic leading some of their sustainability and outreach science initiatives. But Lorraine was one of our students on the field school, and one of the things we ask students to do is, when they come to the field, is to go out and engage with the world, to ask questions, to design an experiment, to think about how would you actually collect data. And it's quite overwhelming for people to be thrust into that, but it's one of the things we do, and that Dr. Leakey was very keen on, and we continue to be very keen on, is that people actually go and learn what is it to be a scientist, but also what is it to be a scientist in this landscape where you have so many different variables and confounding factors and other things that you need to deal with. So one of the fascinating things is when the students come up with their projects, almost all of the projects they have come up with in the now 10 plus years of running the program is they will ask ecological questions, but they also ask very important social and economic questions, because all the work that they're seeing and connecting with has this really important aspect of community and of society more broadly. And so it's something that we are all thinking about as scientists, how do we actually engage with better? But the demand we're seeing from students, and in some ways, students are ahead of the field in many areas, of actually saying, we're going to be interdisciplinary just in the way we ask these questions, how we engage with the community. An important part of being able to do this is doing it with communities that are very receptive, that have understood science, that have felt like they are co-producing knowledge, that are engaged with that process. So that's a critical thing that the Turkana Basin Institute does, is manage and maintain and steward those relationships. And I think for all of us working in aspects of, marine and other areas, as well as working on natural resources, are going to have to think more carefully of how we do this and where we do it and when we do it, as we work out on these questions in the field. So what Lorraine did, she went out, she measured trees, but she was also very clever, because it's hard to collect data in some of these areas. And she looked at our friend Google Earth and was able to collect historical data, and then look at how trees were disappearing. And what she found is that it was very interesting that charcoal was yielding about just under 70 kilos per tree. It took 2 to 3 whole trees to produce a bag of charcoal. Now, these trees, that tree is 400 years old. So it's not a renewable resource on a very short time scale. And that there was each lorry or truckload of charcoal that was being driven out of this region were consuming 600 to 900 trees, and the people were being paid, the community were receiving $3 to $4.50 per tree, which is absolutely nothing. But it's such a poor landscape that people were accepting that, even though, of course, these trees are part of that landscape. They're the main source of sustenance for the goats and for the camels. And it was the poverty that was really driving this. By the time it gets to other parts of Kenya, like so many other things in our world, its value keeps increasing along that market chain, but there's a huge demand. And I was just at a meeting where they were presenting the latest results, and they were saying 200,000 trees per day are being cut down for charcoal production in this landscape. So that's, again, there's no way there's 200,000 trees per day replacing what's been cut down. So we're on a very unsustainable track there. So a couple of more fun things just before I finish up and take questions. Everyone will have heard about insect decline. I'm part of a big paper we're trying to put together on insect declines. It's a very important hot topic right now. This here is a swarm of locusts that were flying by. They don't look like there's much insect decline happening there, but the locusts are an interesting species because here they are feeding on some of the grasses. Just as they change color. So this is actually a mature individual here. The rest is still immature. They go through a last color change mold that turns them this yellow. But the desert locust is a remarkable species. They hadn't been seen in Kenya for over 60 years. And then they appeared a couple of years ago, and you would have seen it. It was all over the news. And what happened? What brought the locusts that had been absent for so long? What had brought them back? And the short answer is climate change. And so these shifts in the Indian Ocean that created this dipole that led to way more rain than we'd seen in recorded history, also came with this flush of locusts. And the immediate response from the government and from everyone was, oh, let's spray them. Again, you'll be proud to know your taxpayer dollars were being spent on chemicals that are banned in America, but should be sprayed all over the world. And so I was part of the team that was helping to respond and talk about the locust and trying to do some science. And what we discovered is that, look, these are desert environments. So they're mostly low production, but if you add one ingredient, the magic ingredient is water, you can turn them, you flip the system to their suddenly very high productive environments, and you have a biomass of protein and fat that's, swarming around, that is on the order of many thousands of tons in any given area. So the locusts, while humans were horrified by them because of all the, the locusts are mentioned like 100 times in the Bible, and I think that's where a lot of our bias against them comes from. Actually, the birds and everybody else were like, yay, it's Christmas. We're having an absolute feast of these locusts. And I was watching them, and we were watching all these things. And as I had to step off this government committee that was set up because I was getting threatened for talking against the pesticides and the approach that was being taken. But I was saying, here's some data. And so what we did then, we were able to set up a little project and actually started making animal feed. So this is my little dog, Jack Russell, called Dudu, which means insect in Kiswahili. And she was very fond of the locust, trying to grab one there. So we worked with a group setup called the Bug Picture. I love that name. And they actually started harvesting the locusts, and we were turning them into animal feed. Because one of the critical things for producing fish, producing chicken in many parts of the world is having a high nutrient, high protein feed for them. And so we were able to do this and to show that insects like the locust, which actually can convert 1-to-1 ratio of feed and water to produce 1 kilo of locust, could be a very sustainable way. And instead of spraying the locusts, we should be using them as we can the landscape. We had to test the locusts, obviously, because we wanted to make sure we didn't use swarms that had been sprayed. And that's when, again, this got very quickly complicated, because we discovered on some of the locusts we were testing chemicals that had been banned for a long time and that were not supposed to be used in any place. And so, that made another complication, but at least we were able to do it and to demonstrate that it can work. And there are now several other projects that are using insects to sustainably produce protein, even if people, especially Westerners, may not like eating them. Well, the Jack Russells have another opinion on this, and definitely the chickens and fish, you should see them, they go mad when they see the locusts coming for them to eat. So another group of insects I'm working a lot on are butterflies, and their amazing diversity in these landscapes. One of the species there is called the brown-veined white. It produces these eruptions that are these incredibly spectacular outbreaks. Some people would use the term, but just very, very large numbers. So again, a weird thing in these dry habitats, you go from sort of one extreme to the other. And so we had students working on this, and in this one tiny part of Turkana, we estimated there were 17.1 billion butterflies that were crossing this narrow place we were observing them. And there were 30-something trillion butterflies in this particular eruption that occurred here just around the institute in Turkana. So just to finish up now, how are we going to solve all of these big problems? How are we going to go out and engage with the world? And so one of the ways we see we're doing it is really through working with students of many different ages and backgrounds. Here are two of the field school students. It's on Central Island in the middle of Lake Turkana. Here we are under acacia, taking a break from the midday heat. We also work with a lot of high schools and local communities. Ikal is a wonderful Turkana woman who's leading a big initiative about sustainability, and she's an environmental and governance advocate. We're planting some trees, and then also working with a lot of local schools. So this is the school on their lunch break, and there I was collecting bees. And people come and say, oh, people are so poor in these landscapes, but on this particular tree, we collected 50 different species of bees. And on the totalist trees, we've gone up to over 500 species of bees. So we really need to think about that in terms of this landscape and where we're going, because it is a very, very high biodiverse landscape. And I don't agree that people are poor in this landscape. They're actually in a very rich landscape. It really, the poverty is a result of the many other aspects of globalization, but there's actually a lot of wealth in the landscape in terms of biodiversity and opportunity. One of the really fun things working in the landscape has been describing new species. So this is Samba Turkana. We named it with the local community, and that was the name they agreed on. And so it turns out it's a really ancient group of bees, and bees have a Gondwanan origin. This is a family of bees called the Melitidae, which have a really amazing relationship with certain plants, but it's so wonderful that it looks like not only did people originate from Turkana, but so did bees much longer ago than people. And then I was just sent this by, I thought I have to throw a fish in there since we're in SoMAS. And this is collected by this absolutely mad, he calls himself the fanatic fisherman. And I think those of you who have fishermen in the family will know that that is often an association, Mufadal. And he caught this fish in a gill net up at Illeret. He's been catching fish all over the region. And who knows what fish that is? So it's an arowana. It's one of the bony-tongued fishes. 400 million years, this species, this group of fishes have been around, and there's the species in Africa, there's one in South America, there's a couple in Asia. And so again, literally a living fossil, if we want to call it that. It's huge, it's about that big. And because he samples in very different ways from how most surveys are done, he's a fisherman looking to catch like the big one and whatever. So he's been able to find some really remarkable things. And we're really hoping that more work on the fish diversity and evolution will be done in the lake. Obviously, the fisheries is so important for the local and national community. But I was so thrilled to see this really remarkable animal is still surviving in the lake in 2022.